So we're going to start off with some questions to all of you. So just to clarify, Edward and Dan are here on video link. So we had Catherine Gunn here a few weeks ago, and she spoke about how she received an email that was forwarded from the NSA asking GCSQ to gather intel about diplomats at the Security Council, and she couldn't stand by it, and that was kind of the point at which she decided that she was going to whistleblow. And I think I'd like to start with a question to both Ed and Dan, which I'm sure you get asked a lot, which is, what was the tipping point for you where you felt that you had to whistleblow, and why did you decide to whistleblow as opposed to raise the issue within the organizations that you were working at?
Dan, do you want to take that one first?
What's that?
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'm not sure Dan could hear, and for what it's worth in the room, we can hear a pretty harsh echo of ourselves. When I was looking at what happened, it took a very long time for me to understand it, and this is really a central topic of my book. We want to believe there's this constant cinematic moment that applies for all of us, that we see the golden document, and it changes everything we believe, and boom, it's done. You have to come forward, you run up the courthouse steps, and that's how it goes. But I worked for the NSA as a contractor, then the CIA as a contractor, then the CIA as a staff employee overseas, then back to the NSA as a contractor, then back to the CIA as a contractor, then back to the NSA as a contractor, the NSA as a contractor again. And through that whole complex sort of shell game of working for this part of the government, that part of the government, back and forth, at every point when you work in the most classified parts of intelligence, because of a principle called compartmentation, you look at the machine through a soda straw. You're not supposed to see the big picture. So what changed it for me and made it where I could no longer stand by was when I had reached a point in my career where suddenly I had the access to look over the walls. And instead of simply seeing what was happening in my vault, which is what we called an office, I could see what was happening in all of them because I had a very unusual level of clearance at that time. And then I was able to discover this secret legal history of the creation of the NSA's system of mass surveillance, a top secret classified program called Stellar Wind. This was an internal watchdog's report which had been suppressed and actually completely changed when it was released to the public. And once I saw this, that had interviews with members of government at all levels, including the most senior. It named names. It said who did what and when. And then I compared what actually happened to what the public believed to have happened. I realized that the government had deceived us really on a breathtaking scale, and I believe that that document was something that the public needed to see. And if you're interested, that actual document has been published in the Washington Post. If you look for the Stellar Wind report, like stars and wind, that's the code name of it, Stellar Wind. That's what drove me forward.
I'm not sure if Dan can hear the questions, but...
Yes, I can.
Okay, there we go.
I'm struck, that your recent guest, Catherine Gunn, is a friend of mine and a hero of mine, like Ed Snowden himself. It behaved actually extraordinarily because she had the experience of seeing evidence of a request for criminal action to start a criminal war, an illegal war, come across her desk, and within 24 hours she had decided that she had to share that with the public in the hopes of averting a war. She did it in a timely way before the war with the real hope that Prime Minister Blair would carry out his commitment not to go to war without the second resolution by the UN Security Council. And actually her release did prevent that Security Council vote, and Blair went to war anyway to be in good with the United States, like so many others. In my case, and perhaps like Ed's, I was aware of criminal actions and lies and getting us into a war long before I did anything about it. So the question, I kept my mouth shut, like everybody around me. We were all complicit, in effect, in our silence by this act unconstitutional act of getting us into war on false pretenses, wrongful war. And all of us, starting with the president, but all of us who kept our silence for years, were actually violating our oath of office, which in this country is not an oath to a king or a queen or a Führer or a dictator, not even an oath to secrecy. It's an oath to defend our Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And by keeping silent when Congress was being lied to in that war, we were violating that oath. Constitution, which gives the power of war and peace only to the Congress. That's been eroded, in fact, ignored. Major thing differentiating our Constitution from that of the British when we declared a war of national liberation, the first one, the War of Independence. It was years later, really, after I'd been to Vietnam, I'd seen what the human consequences were of those lies and of that policy in Vietnam, and I was determined to try to get us out of it and stop it. That was my concern. I tried that first for a couple of years inside with the access to very highest levels in the White House, not the president himself, but people, Paul Rosdow in particular, just below the president, and in the State Department and elsewhere, with no effect. When I read in the Pentagon Papers, to which I had authorized access, a McNamara study of the war, and I finally read the earliest part of those papers, which I put off, basically thinking they were less relevant, I discovered that our support of the French in 1945 to 1954, 9 years, had been very consciously supportive of a French effort to reconquer a former colony that had declared its independence, an anti-nationalist, an anti-independence effort, which was clearly contrary to American ideals, supposedly of independence and freedom in general, an imperial project which had no legitimacy whatever. And that continued to be the case when we took over the French role. So to me, all the people killed as a result of that war, there would have been no war without U.S. financing it and finally taking part in it. There would have been no war without that, and that meant that all the deaths on both sides, seemed to me, had been unjustifiable homicide or murder. And that was a process that, in my view, I had to do everything I could to end quickly as possible, not wait for a graceful outcome or saving our face or whatever. Two other things, however, entered my life at that time. One, I had the example, which I think no other country has actually offered, to my knowledge, of 5,000 men going to prison nonviolently, evading, or rather rejecting their draft participation to send the strongest possible message of what I believe too, that the war was wrong, that it was wrong to participate in it, and they went to prison rather than going to Canada or Sweden or even declaring CO status. I felt the power of that action. It was a Gandhian action. Martin Luther King was the inspiration of many of these people, Dorothy Day in this country. And I realized that that was an effective way. I realized the effect on me, which was that it put the question in my mind, at last, what can I do to help stop this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? I took it for granted. I had several actions in mind, well, not all of which involved prison, which seemed even more effective. And I'll mention something that's extremely timely right now that I've rarely mentioned but it's become so much in the news in the last week. The experience of the president, Trump now, pardoned men probably charged and in one case convicted already of serious war crimes, of murder, pardoning them on the grounds that they were warriors, that had been trained to kill, and that it was wrong to prosecute them for killing. The exact same thing happened in 1969, just 50 years ago last month, when President Nixon ended the prosecution of some special forces, as in this case, by the way, special forces murdering someone they suspected wrongly of being a double agent. They had hidden that murder from their superiors. The superiors in turn had lied to their superiors up to General Abrams in McAskill, Vietnam. He had misled why he was having the trial, which was largely because he'd been lied to by a colonel below him. The Army of the Secretary of the Army in that case called off the case, saying that he had done it for various reasons, which was a lie because the president had, in fact, for political reasons, canceled that case. In other words, it was a carbon copy of what's just happened with President Trump pardons of these charged war crimes, and in some cases, definitely, I believe, the witnesses who testified to actual war crimes of murder. And I realized at the time, the very day that I read that, which was September 30th, 1969, this is a system I've worked for 15 years, 3 years in the Marine Corps, and the rest for the Defense Department. It's a system that lies from bottom to top, from a sergeant and woman officer up to the president, to conceal murder. And I won't be part of that anymore. I'm not going to lie anymore because someone has told me I should, or even that I've made a promise to do it, to keep lies when that promise, keeping that promise involves harming others, condemning many others to death, as in the current case, where the president's action, essentially wiping out war crimes from the category of military law, will have the effect of demoralizing many of our troops into committing acts of murder in the future. So I decided that I would put out 7,000 pages of documents, of lies, betrayals, treaty, war crimes, wrongful war, deceptions of the public and Congress continuously. I put that in my safe, and I went to my later co-conspirator, my later co-defendant, who asked him if he knew whether there was a Xerox machine, and we started on the process of that. October 1st, 1969. When you mentioned that Snowden's release, like Chelsea Manning's, well, them were the largest, was even larger disclosures, unauthorized disclosures of classified information in history. That's true. It reflects the change in technology in the 50 years in between. I could not have copied 7,000 pages without then the Xerox technology at the time. I couldn't have done the hundreds of thousands of pages digitally that put out. I have never had any doubt that I did the right thing, although it did expose me to a possible thing of 115 years in prison, 12 felony counts. Just as Julian Assange is now charged with even more, 17 counts under the Espionage Act, a possible 175 years in prison. He did exactly what he should have done as a journalist, using the material from Chelsea Manning and his course in 2010 of murder, a video entitled correctly Collateral Murder, which showed American troops committing an atrocity for which they were never tried or charged, killing more than a dozen unarmed civilians, including 2 Reuters reporters on the ground. The video showed this very clearly, and they're laughing about it. And for that, Chelsea and other things, Chelsea spent 7.5 years in prison. Ed Snowden, even more. And then he also showed torture on a wide scale. Ed Snowden revealing massive violence in the Constitution and our domestic laws, criminality. And he himself indicted for revealing his crime, while none of the people have been charged or indicted as an effect. So it goes. But Ed did the right thing, Chelsea did the right thing, Assange did the right thing at that time, and I did the right thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I think for both of you, the objective became clearer and clearer throughout your careers and throughout your sort of time at your various employers, and sort of what you wanted to, at the end, was what you wanted to achieve was very clear to both of you. And I think in terms of turning to you, Ewan, the question is, obviously as a journalist, you'd worked on a variety of important matters, but it wasn't clear to you at the beginning what Ed was going to disclose to you and why you were having to fly over to Hong Kong. So why did you decide to pursue this case?
Can I just say first that I'm extremely proud to be in this panel. It's a real privilege to be sitting sandwiched between 2 of the greatest whistleblowers of the last 50 years. Journalists need whistleblowers. The best stories come sometimes from data dumps, from hackers, but the best stories are always from whistleblowers. And some whistleblowers act out of, they're angry because they've been passed over for promotion, they want money, or some other motive. In the case of both Daniel Ellsburg and Ed, they did it for a matter of principle, and that's why they stand out, and I'm really proud to know them both and to have worked with Ed. I saw him in Moscow a few months ago, and I owe him dinner. I was supposed to pay, but I didn't have any money. I was working out at the Guardian's office in New York. Ed's heard the story lots of times. And the US editor, Janine Gibson, said to me, I want you to go to Hong Kong tomorrow. There's a guy who says he's a spy and he's going to leak thousands of documents. And we both laughed. But we thought we'd go anyway, just in case. But the expectation was it would be a hoax. And when I met Ed for the first time, and he told me his life story, it seemed so extraordinary. He trained with the US Special Forces, worked with the CIA in Geneva, worked for NSA in Japan, worked back in Maryland for the NSA, then off to Hawaii, again with the NSA, one of the biggest listing. It just seemed so improbable that everything he said to me that over that week in Hong Kong and everything subsequent to that has turned out to be true. And I've met him lots of times since, and I'm full of admiration for what he's done and full of admiration for what Daniel Ellsberg's done. Just one last thing. There's no real consequences for me as a result of meeting Edward Snowden. There's sort of talk maybe closing the Guardian down or sort of throwing myself and Alan Rusbridger and other Guardian people in jail, but it was never realistic. But Ed and Daniel Ellsberg, it's the whistleblowers every time that suffer the consequences, not the journalists. If Ed leaves Moscow and he's back in the States, he faces the prospect of probably a lifetime in jail. Daniel Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act and again faced a lengthy jail term. Chelsea Manning was put in jail for 35 years. If they take Julian Assange back to America, he's looked at a lifetime in jail. I mean, this is totally wrong that the whistleblowers should face all the consequences. But I'm glad that the journalists so far have got off scot-free.
I mean, kind of building from that point, I think in light of the circumstances that whistleblowers do face, I guess my question for Ed and Dan is sort of a more broad thing, is you had such clear objectives in what you did. Do you think it's worked, and would you do it again for both of you?
I'll speak for myself on that. I did expect prison for life when I began copying the Pentagon Papers. I was not aware of all the consequences. There was a good reason for that. That hadn't been in. I was the first person to prosecute on the Act or any other way for giving information to Americans. I didn't know that. And there was a reason for that. We don't have the Official Secrets Act that Britain has had, long had. And in fact, the Espionage Act itself, which was intended for spies, just immediately after we had entered the war, which the war in 1917, many legislators said we don't want a British Official Secrets Act. We have a First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. It doesn't have that constitutional amendment, almost no other country does. But it precludes a British-type Official Secrets Act which would criminalize any and all release of protected information, or classified information. After all, not all of that classified information reveals crime, but anything that does reveal crime, or horrible predictions, false policies, deceptions, will be classified. And really that information needs to be out if we are to hold our government accountable at all. But I didn't know any of it essentially when I actually copied the Pentagon Papers. Certainly, so I did it in the expectation actually of putting out 7,000 copies, which I assumed was more than anyone else had done, that I would suffer the full penalty for that. Now, would I do it again? No, absolutely. How often should there be a Pentagon paper? I waited 39 years until Chelsea Manning put out her major, digitally produced hundreds of thousands of papers. In between, nothing at all similar, was very disappointing to me. People just aren't willing to suffer the risk and the consequences of ostracism, of losing their clearances, their career, possibly their families, their marriages, and even be prosecuted as I was after that incident. Still, arguably accepted that the Pentagon Papers had shortened the war, and in turn, by, I must say, a rather miraculous set of events, including the exposure by leakers and others of presidential criminality against me, something one couldn't count on at all, I was free. And I thought that, in other words, it wasn't impossible to tell the truth and live to tell the tale. And nevertheless, it took almost 40 years for someone else to do the same, and then 3 years later, Ed Snowden. So that encouraged me, but can there be a Pentagon Papers every 40 years or so? How about every month or 6 months or every year, and virtually any involved? They really are need the document. The resignation alone is not enough. You need documents to show that your government is lying to you, which people are surprisingly and obviously refusing to believe without proof of it. And so to really know what the government is doing in our name, there's no substitute for, now on the one hand, whistleblowers, and on the other hand, press like you, MacAskill, who are, I miss it every time, sorry not for you, but to release it. Without that, nothing gets out. Actually, the indications of the mass surveillance testimony on that had gone to the New York Times in 2004, before the election of George W. Bush during Iraq. And they sat on it. Times, the White House warned them that they would be accused of having blood on their hands. It was another terrorist attack, and that kept most newspapers silent for doing it. So I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but I think the factor not to go to the New York Times is their precise behavior back in 2004. So, and you chose, among others, the Guardian, and of course, the Walden Lower Poitras. So we're seeing right now, by the way, the whistleblower who has started with amongst the president right now, used the channels which were clogged. Supposedly, a complaint or her complaint was meant to go directly to Congress. In fact, the White House stopped the law, and only unauthorized disclosures, not using the channels, by leakers to Congress made them aware that this complaint existed and got it finally into the hands of Congress. So you need these several elements, the newspapers or some distributing way of getting this out to the public, and someone who is willing to take the risk of ostracism in order to save many lives or preserve a constitutional system. Yes, I would do it again, and I would urge others to do it much more often. We need many more whistleblowers, not fewer. And of course, our administration and others are working very hard to intimidate people, intimidate possible witnesses, like this whistleblower on whom the president has practically put a bullseye on the back of that whistleblower, in effect calling his posse of vigilantes out in the public to do to them what we used to do to spies. And so that's the kind of risk you have to take, that it is worth taking. A war's worth of lives may be at stake.
Let me jump on just to the back of that to get to the direct question, which is this idea of, did it work? Was it effective? If you have a whistleblower who's coming forward with not strictly a policy objection, or a policy objective, but an idea that there is something that has been concealed that needs to be known by the public. I think I've heard Dan say before that he didn't think the revelation of this was going to end the Vietnam War. But it's not about one person doing it on their own. It's about a collective action, right? You have to ask yourself, did it work? Well, what does working look like in these kind of contexts? Any kind of democracy is ultimately going to be, a team sport. It's a platitude at this point when we talk about it in that kind of language. But the idea is, in any democracy, government derives its legitimacy from a single principle when you get down to the most atomic level. And that is that they derive a mandate from the consent of the governed. But whistleblowers posit that consent of the governed in these contexts is only meaningful if it's informed, right? What is the purpose of all of the pageantry of elections if we are casting our votes on the basis of lies? And I think this is particularly relevant in the UK today, where we see things like, candidates for prime minister or active prime minister are concealing information about the National Health Service. We see it happen in every country again and again. This is a constant battle for information control today. But when we look at that baseline dynamic and we look at what whistleblowers are struggling for, it is not strictly to end a policy. It is not strictly to end a program. It is to retain for the people a level of control over the future of their society. It's a struggle for the agency of the public relative to the government. And this is something that I think people misunderstand broadly, at least about my case in 2013. Yes, all of the conversation was about surveillance, because the documents that were revealed regarded surveillance and what the government was engaged in that was unlawful related to surveillance. But the scandal was not surveillance strictly, from my perspective. The scandal was how government had been able to abuse the state secrets privilege and the general opacity of the structures that exist in the modern world to enact an enormous program that completely changed the borders of our rights, right? The boundaries of what we can and cannot do relative to what we believe we can and cannot do. And it happened entirely in secret. It happened without a vote. It happened without the awareness of the vast majority of members of Congress in the United States, to say nothing of the public, to say nothing of courts, to say nothing of journalists. Even in the executive branch that nominally directed these programs, very few people understood that it was happening. And so I think this is what we need to remember, is a whistleblower can be effective in the micro scale. They end a program, they end an abuse, they even end a war, which is a tremendously valuable public service. And yet, on the macro scale, the issues are much larger. We need to think about the accountability for, well, how did that program come to be? How was that war launched and sustained? And how do we manage that, right? How do we construct a system of checks and balances to arrest the process that puts us on that slope? And what I think is interesting is the more information the public has access to true and factual information, I believe the better quality of democratic decisions we get as a result of that. When the inputs are better, the outputs are better. And this is to say what whistleblowing is actually about. And what it should be measured on is not actually the outcomes of, oh, it changed this law, which in my case it did. Oh, it changed this program, which in my case it did. It did not end mass surveillance, but I did not set out to end mass surveillance. That was not my task. I was not the president of secrets. I was not the president of the United States. I was not the president of the internet. I wanted to give the public enough information so that they could decide the kind of world that they want to have, the kind of future that they want to steer toward, and to impose some limitation on what the government was able to do without the public's knowledge or consent, so that at least if we're going to do these things, we have more of a public say in doing so. And the thing that gives me a tremendous amount of hope, despite the fact that, yes, mass surveillance still exists, is when you look at public responses, they're multifaceted. We have won in courts, we have won in legislatures, but we have also won in the technical realm. When you look at 2013 on a chart of encrypted internet traffic, you see a sharp spike. And that has continued. It's no longer 50% of internet traffic, when before it was actually, I believe, in the lower 30s that was encrypted, which is to say protected from mass surveillance. They could still see the messages were being sent, but they couldn't see the content of these messages. It's now over 80%. And that's accelerating, and that's because of the work of people like you. It's young people, it's students, it's academics and researchers who are setting aside the political process, where I will make my will known. There is also what we do individually, there's what we do collectively, there's what we do through our labor, our research, our intellectual output to change the status quo, not just in our countries, in our jurisdictions, but globally by changing the paradigm. And this is critical, and I think missed by many people, is let's say there's a whistleblower in the United Kingdom, and tomorrow, it's a golden age of unicorns and rainbows and happiness. There's no more wrongdoing. But the benefit of that largely ends at the borders of the United Kingdom. It doesn't help people in Russia. Doesn't help people in China. Doesn't help people in Iran, right? To change that, we have to change things structurally, and that largely happens through global persuasion. It happens through scientific force, it happens through technological force, it happens through intellectual force, by winning the argument on a larger scale. And I think, I'll shut up here, when we think about democracy, the fatal flaw of democracy is if the adversaries, whether it's of a policy, whether it's of society, whether it's the very idea of self-government, if they can limit what we know to be happening, if they can limit our understanding of the facts, they can limit what we do about them. We have to be able to understand what is happening in a democracy in order to decide what we should do about it. And what gives me hope, that Dan underlined quite well, I think, is there was a 40-year gap between when he came forward and really history's probably first mass disclosure and the next. But then following Manning, I came forward only a few years later. Following me, there have been many others who came forward. And just in the last weeks, in the last months, we have seen mass disclosures come from China about the abuses in the Xinjiang region. We have seen them happen in Iran. We have also seen them happen in the context of corporate institutions in the Pentagon Papers a few years prior. And so what we are seeing, I think, is a global rising awareness in the public of the crucial and quite central nature of the public's access to facts, whether we are in a democracy or even whether we're not, in terms of for individuals operating at scale, how can we coordinate and how can we respond to the many problems and controversies that exist in any given age unless we are made aware of them. So yes, in terms of, in my case, did it make a difference? Did it work? If you're asking if I was trying to end mass surveillance, no, it didn't, but I wasn't trying to. If you're asking, does everybody know about it now, I think certainly that has changed categorically.
I think that's super interesting. Also in the respect of when you're talking about macro and micro, I feel like that also expands the definition of whistleblower that we use quite often, in the sense that I think, for example, I was reading this article where they were talking about how the silence breakers in Hollywood, about sort of sexual harassment in Hollywood, were all referred to as silence breakers as opposed to whistleblowers. Yet that's also a sort of disclosure of information that helps us make decisions about our day-to-day lives, and also about the sort of power structures that we live in. I think I'm going to round off with one last question from me, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. And this is something you kind of got into, Ed. But to round things off, what advice do the three of you have for all of us in the room as students at university who are going to go out into the world and want to make a positive impact? What should we be looking out for? And what do you think we should be doing to sort of use this information? What channels should we be going through? Should we start with you, Ewan, and then...
The first time I met Ed Snowden, the first piece of advice he gave me was I had an iPhone and I was going to do the interview on my phone, and he said, get that out the room in the Mira Hotel. And he says, you'll find a room down the corridor and put it in the fridge. And not even just the fridge, put it in the freezer compartment. Because with that phone, you might as well just give your whole life story away. It tracks you, it's got access to your emails, phone. I mean, your whole life story is there. And if somebody wants to know, if security agencies or private companies want to know where you've been, what you've done, who you've been speaking to, it's as easy as that. So I mean, there isn't a freezer compartment nearby, Ed, but I'll put it there just now. What Ed did, he's been consistent. At the time in Hong Kong, he didn't say he wanted to end mass surveillance. He said that he thought the world should be aware of it. I mean, Ed's been quite modest. The legislation has changed in Congress, banning the mass surveillance of phone calls, bulk data collection, as the intelligence agencies prefer to call it. But I mean, it doesn't apply to emails. So, and most of the communication now is by email rather than phone calls. In the UK, GCHQ have changed the legislation as well. But all they did was to make legal the illegal things they were doing before. I mean, when they hacked people, and they said they didn't, they passed legislation not to protect citizens or protect individuals. They passed legislation to make legal what they were doing before. There's been sort of court cases that have come out and said that, you know, what the Americans and the Brits were doing is illegal. But the main change is the change in perception. A lot of it's anecdotal. Now people know. Before, people might have said there's a danger we're facing surveillance. Now we know it for a fact, and most people accept how easy it can be done. And it's not just the security agencies and the intelligence agencies and the police you have to worry about. It's all the private companies, Facebook, Google. I mean, your life stories are out there, and you have to take steps to protect it. One way to counter it, and this is one piece of advice I'd give, and it's the piece that Ed would as well, use encrypted chat. I mean, that's one mechanism for trying to protect your personal details. Ed recommends, not quite royal approval, but it's come from Ed, is use Signal. He's in Moscow and he's working on devices and ways for journalists to protect sources, to protect their communications. So, you know, people are fighting back.
And for the two of you, is the advice the same, or?
I'll go into this. So I think Look, it's a tough thing. There are so many ways to answer it. People start with the practical things, kind of like you mentioned there, where it's, use this, use that. But the thing is, it's constantly changing. And I don't want to tell you guys to get in an arms race with an intelligence community where only in the United States, just in one country, they have a $75 billion a year annual budget. I think we have to focus on changing the paradigms, right? Look at what the structures are that are creating the harmful status quo in the context of mass surveillance, right? Because that's my familiarity. There are two ways, largely, that the government monitors populations, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Russia. There are the origins of communications, right? Person A, person B, company A, company B, whatever. It has to have a source and destination for every communication. And there are basically 2 or 3 points where you can get access to these communications. The classic one, the means by which mass surveillance works, is in transit, right? Think just briefly how your communications get from your phone to Facebook or to the person that you're calling at the pizza shop or whatever, right? Your phone is not directly connected to this. It has to go through a long series of intermediaries, right? You want to think about the internet as a fabric of a zillion tiny threads that are all interconnected. And person A says, hey, I'm trying to get to person B. I don't even know how to get there. Help me find each intersection until I get there. Now, at that giant fabric, at all of these many different intersections, or rather at many of these different intersections, there are traffic cameras, right? Some of them are run by criminals, some of them are run by companies, some of them are run by governments. But they're recording everything they see, holding it forever, selling it, doing whatever they want with it. And before I came forward, again, only 30% of the communications that cross this path, and if you think about it as an actual path, right? 30% of the people who crossed this path had any clothes on at all. Our communications were electronically naked. So the first paradigm shift that we're trying to do is encrypt everything, right? And this means when you cross the path, people still see that you are crossing it, but they can't see what's under your skirt. And I think this is a crucial advance, but it doesn't stop the fact that on a global scale, on a population scale, there are companies and governments that are trying to monitor now that they can't get as much of the content of what we're saying. They can't see our communications in terms of what you say to someone you care about, what you purchased on the internet, what article on a site that you read. They can still go, well, this person was connecting to Facebook, or, well, they were connecting to the website of this political party. We can't see what they read on that site, but we can see that they were connected to this political party, and they go there all the time. So maybe they can infer this person is a supporter of it. If they see you're going to the website for an abortion clinic, they don't need to know what the website said to be able to infer a lot about your activities. The fact that you call your mother briefly afterwards, the fact that 2 phones happen to go to the same hotel in the middle of the night and overnight and then go to a different place elsewhere, you can infer a lot of information from just metadata without the content, right? This is the next paradigm shift that we haven't broken yet. What we need to do is be able to have the source and the destination of a communication meet together online to exchange information. And there are ways we do this in a rough and inefficient way today through things like the Tor network that's akin to a giant shell game to make those connections less obvious, right? And the point of this is to hide your social graph, to keep your private life private, which is to say, privacy isn't about absolute secrecy, it's about selective sharing. It's about when you want to tell a company something, you can. When you want to tell someone you trust something, you can, but that choice is yours. You have that agency. It cannot be robbed from you systemically the way it is today. The other ways they can get these communications are to go to the transmitters, that source and origin of the destination, and steal it directly from those devices. No matter what your encryption is, no matter how great your routing in the middle is, if they hack your phone, they can see everything on the phone that you can. You paid for the device, but they own the device because they have control over it. And the last thing is we have to think about where data rests. If it doesn't rest only on our device, but it rests at an endpoint, a third-party endpoint like a Facebook, like a Google, like a Telegram, where these companies that do encrypt your communications hold a key to your entire life. And they say, oh, well, we don't normally look at this. It's not something that we want to do, but we hold the key in case the government asks us to unlock it. Then they can get everything you have. And the thing is, you go, oh, well, you know, I trust my government. Do you trust Russia's government? Do you trust China's government? Do you trust the U.S. government? Do you trust the German government? Do you trust the Brazilian government? They've all got courts, right? And they can issue the same kind of orders. This is what I mean when I want you guys to think about things at the paradigmatic level. But on an even broader level, beyond surveillance, you know, ditch surveillance, pretend it doesn't exist. There are two larger concepts, two prerequisites to any action. One is simply to care. The fact that you guys are in this room right now for this talk says that you do care. You know, you could be watching Netflix right now, but you're not. You're here, and that is crucial. And the second thing is risk. Being willing to chance something, being willing to invest something of yourself, which will provoke a large chance of failure in order to change the status quo. You have to recognize that the world that we inherit is never good enough. If we accept that the world that we have is good enough, that's the end of progress, right? Discomfort is what drives us forward. Recognizing something is suboptimal drives us forward. And trying to improve upon that, failing to improve upon that multiple times until you do something better, that matters. But it's not enough to believe that things need to change. You have to be willing to stand for something. You have to be willing to dare, to risk, and to pay that cost, even if it is simply the cost of effort, even if it is simply the cost of an uncomfortable conversation with your friends or family or your loved ones, to persuade them as to the importance of something that they don't understand and they don't care about, to make it relevant to them, that drags us out of the jungle of history.
It's very, very interesting as a perspective. I think also, I mean, thinking about paradigm shifts, it's incredible to see like where we are today versus where we were 10 years ago on this issue. And I think it also, I mean, just to return to the Me Too example, for example, you can see that paradigm shifts happening there. And I think it's very awe-inspiring and you know, makes people have a positive outlook on the future. I think just in order to allow for one audience question, I think just given the time constraints that we have, Ed and Dan have kindly decided to stay on for an extra 15 minutes, given that we were working with the tech for the first 15 minutes of this talk. I'm going to try and open up to the floor, and then we'll try and get answers from all three of you on the question that they're asking. So would anyone like to ask a question? Please raise your hands. Shall we go for there? Yeah. Can you please wait for them? Yeah, because they won't hear unless you're on the mic.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Shahzad, and I have a question about what do you think about the future of AI and its social impact in terms of mass surveillance? Thank you.
Thank you. We might be able to get another question because I'll try to go through this one quickly. When we look at artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning, what we're talking about is, for those who are less familiar, a way to aggregate, or rather to take the aggregate of the enormous amounts of data that we have available today, 10 zillion cat pictures on the internet, right? And crunch them basically through some linear algebra to do things like go, what are the edges that exist in all of these images that are common to pictures of cats that are not common to any other pictures of cars, pictures of dogs, pictures of whatever. And from this, can we derive a model that, by the way, the people who created the algorithm themselves do not understand the model. They do not understand what it's working on. They do not understand what it is that actually makes this algorithm decide that a cat image is a cat image, beyond the fact that it's using edge detection and things like that. It just knows there's an average somewhere in there that's been calculated that says, with some probability, this is a cat. Now they apply that to people. And they say, this is, with some probability, this person, because of the edges of their face distinguish them from all other faces, the distance between their eyes, and so on and so forth. And then we start to go from this and apply it to decision making. Can we go, this constellation of activities, which is not for image recognition now, but applying the same concepts to things like loan defaults, to things like academic grades in university, to things like lateness at work, to things like speeding tickets, to things like spending habits, to things like the burden that you put on the national health system, all of these things to calculate your desirability for some outcome relative to the others that you're competing with for that resource. And this system, which no human understands how it actually works at the most atomic level, give everything up and go, well, the computer said this person should get it and you shouldn't get it. This person will be approved, this person will be denied. This person's more likely to be a member of an opposition that I don't like, so let's get rid of them. This person's more likely to be a recidivist or a criminal or whatever. And then we go, well, with some probability, the machines seem to do all right by that. Now, what about the false positives, or what about the false negatives? What about the fact that some of these things don't work at all? For example, we've seen facial recognition researchers trying to go, these faces are the average for someone who is homosexual. And these faces are the average for someone who is not. And from this, therefore, you can input a face, and we can predict whether this person is more likely to be gay or straight. That is enormously problematic, and China is the world leader of this. We see them using it in repressive ways. We need to understand that artificial intelligence and machine learning, and then when we get to the next step, general artificial intelligence, right, where it's actually thinking and teaching itself, it can revise itself, it can make untrained decisions in new ways, or it can train itself in more simpler ways. That we start to lose the leash on these kind of things. It is a Pandora's box, which we must accept will be opened. But we must also accept that we do not today have the mechanisms or ability or understanding to handle the products of the realization of these systems at scale. And so therefore, I have argued that what we need to do is we can't ban, and we shouldn't ban, research into these things, not academic research, not individual research, not anything like this, no publication. But we should ban the international commercial trade in this. We should remove the commercial profit incentive, the exploitation incentive for the application of this technology, right? We need to understand it, we need to advance it, but we need to make sure that we don't produce a system of incentives that promote or make the most advantageous move for corporate and individual and governmental actors in global society. We don't want to make those incentives such that it is in their interest to create systems that subordinate people to processes that no one understands and that we are very unlikely to be able to control without much more time to understand them.
I don't know if you or Dan have comments on AI. I feel like it's very much one tech geek in this conversation.
Sure.
But
I'm quite happy to hear some more questions.
yeah, I think maybe we take another question. Would anyone like to just go for there at the front?
Thanks. This question is for everyone, but particularly Mr. MacAskill. What's your view on the future of whistleblowers in the context of private corporations and their influence over the publication of sensitive or controversial material? Particularly sort of, say for example, there's been a lot of talk about the Washington Post's inability to criticise Jeff Bezos. How can we ensure that even if there are whistleblowers willing to take a stand, that the journalistic institutions are strong enough to stand up to financial and corporate pressure against that information getting out? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll really try to keep this one short. Sorry, I didn't hear. Ewan, were you getting in there?
No. You go for it.
Okay. Then yeah. Look, the best thing that I can see here is whistleblower protection laws being reformed. We have the EU's Whistleblower Protection Directive, I believe it's called, or regulation, which unfortunately has yet to be adopted by member states, as is tradition in the EU. But it's very well designed and very well intentioned, which has a specific difference from the US structures particularly, and many national structures particularly, almost certainly in the UK as well. Normally they construct whistleblower protection regimes, whether corporate or governmental, whether we're talking civil or criminal liability, that say, yes, you can report something, but you have to report something through proper channels. It is the institution that legitimates and determines the protection of a disclosure that says you did the right thing and you do this. As Dan mentioned earlier, in the United States, this system has never worked. It has no history of working. It's not working in the current case where the president is trying to drag someone who's exposed his own wrongdoing individually through glass. Right? The EU is proposing that whistleblowers should report through these internal institutional processes or through press processes or through neutral processes in cases where they have a reasonable belief, and this is a very marked change from current systems and it is an important one, a reasonable belief that doing so, subordinating themselves to these systems, will be effective in reforming the abuse that they're trying to report, and two, that it is unlikely to result in retaliation, or that they have a reasonable belief that it will not result in retaliation. That's an extraordinary change, and it's crucial. Right now, as you say, in Washington Post type circumstances, Facebook type circumstances, Google type circumstances, Facebook and Google, we've had whistleblowers, and in every case they lose their job, right? It's standard. That's how it works, because you cannot ask yourself or ask protection from the institution that is going to be aggrieved by your disclosure. I'll shut up there and turn it over to the other.
I meant for you to go first. I wasn't. I mean, that's the fundamental nature of the media industry. Now, the Guardian doesn't have any owners. We're run by a trust, so we're free to do what we want and say what we want. And Glenn Greenwald was working for the Guardian at the time, and that's why Ed ended up coming to us. I love the New York Times and I love the Post, but it is a problem. In 2006, I think, in the run-up to the US election, George W. Bush was standing for re-election. The New York Times, a whistleblower went to them and with information about wireless illegal wireless tap, and they sat on it for 18 months. The election was over because the security services or someone said to the editor at the time, you'll be undermining national security. And that's why Ed ended up coming to the Guardian rather than the New York Times. It's not just Bezos, and the Post is a great product, the New York Times is a great product, but they are vulnerable. Bloomberg has announced his presidential bid, and basically told his reporters they're going to be limited in what they can say about him. You know, so it is a major problem. Okay, just a quick point on whistleblowers. I mean, there are no real defences for whistleblowers. If you're a whistleblower in the education department, health department or whatever, the sort of limited defences. If you're a whistleblower from inside the intelligence communities, you see things that are wrong, you have no real defence. The effect goes back to the States. He wouldn't be able to face a jury. It would be a judge who would decide whether he's committed a crime or not under the Espionage Act. So you need proper defences for whistleblowers. They should be encouraged to come forward.
Okay, I think, Dan, unless you have last remarks on that question, I think we're going to have to wrap up because we're running out of time. Let's just check.
He may have stepped away. It looks like his mic is off.
Oh, right. Okay. Martin, can you... Is there anything you can...
We could also, I don't know the time you guys have in the room, but I feel bad that we haven't gotten a chance to get to a lot of audience questions. If you want to take one more while we wait for Dan, I'd be happy to do so.
I think I would like to take one more. Should we see there at the back?
Hi there. My name is Keshav Nera. I just have a question for Ed, if I may. What's your opinion on end-to-end encrypted services such as WhatsApp? Do you think they have a place in the world, and do you think they're going to survive with governments increasingly putting pressure on trying to get a backdoor into them?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a very timely one. I actually just wrote a opinion piece in no less than The Guardian on this very issue. It's what I talked about before, about there are the 3 points of interception. There is transit, there are endpoints, and then there are these middlemen, these silos that hold things. For those in the audience who are not familiar with it, end-to-end encryption is where the only people who hold the keys to unlock the content of a communication are the originating device and the receiving device. Even if the communication itself is held by middlemen, the middlemen don't have the key to it, so it's like a package that they can't read. This has been the solution that has been proposed by a lot of technologists to the problems of 2013, where we saw all of the largest companies in the internet were sort of cooperating against the public interest. We saw groups like the British version of the NSA, the GCHQ, were just outrageously intercepting any communication they could get their hands on, including people's webcam images, and they found out it was just tons of naked people, and they didn't really care. They kept the program running for a long time. Then we look at things like how this was applied, what kind of targets were being picked for. And in the British case, at least, we saw that the GCHQ wasn't using these powers so much to go after terrorists, to go after criminals, to go after, militaries, as you might expect. In fact, their dragnets were intentionally grabbing an enormous amount of information from journalists. Their emails, they saw that they were getting human rights groups, and even by the very, very, very lax standards of intelligence and legislative oversight of surveillance in the UK, they ruled that it was illegal, right? But this is what end-to-end encryption is meant to do. Instead, you send a message anywhere. Anybody can intercept it, and it's okay, because only 2 people can unlock it. And the only way to get around this, and you can get around it, but it's extremely difficult and it's extremely costly, is by hacking the devices at the ends of the communication. It's the ones that hold the keys. Because what you're doing is you're making the messages, the content, the things that are shuttling across the internet less sensitive. And you're making the keys that do not travel, which is a very clever hack, making those the sensitive bits. Governments obviously are beginning to complain about this because it works so well. What this does is all of these mass surveillance systems that they've used to intrude into all of our lives at scale, with no regard whatsoever to whether or not you're actually suspected of any wrongdoing. Your communications are being intercepted right now, every day, all the time, sitting in this room at this lecture, simply because everyone's are being intercepted, right? Government doesn't call it mass surveillance. They deny mass surveillance is happening, but they admit to bulk collection, which is a euphemism for the same exact thing. Now, what this means is now they have a whole lot of data that they can't read. They can still derive, as I mentioned before, that social connection information. They can tell you, call your mom, or don't. They can tell who you love, who you contact the most, the proximity based on the frequency of interchange. But they can't get what you're actually saying unless they hack your devices. Now, technologists, human rights advocates, journalists, everyone recognizes this is actually an improvement. Because in targeted cases where the government has an individualized suspicion of wrongdoing, where they can justify the effort and the cost, they can still hack those people's phones. They can steal them, they can break into them remotely, they can do what they need to do in order to steal the keys and then read everything they want. Then they have greater access, but it is a larger level of effort. And the cost creates sort of a natural limitation on how frequently they can use these powers, to what extent they can apply these authorities, which is actually what we want. We don't want to forbid any kind of surveillance whatsoever, because everyone would acknowledge there are criminals that need to be investigated, right? There are dangerous people in the world whose plans we should try to discover and whose plans we should try to thwart. It is about scale. It is about selectivity. What they're trying to do is attack the population at scale, monitor and control and influence the population at scale, rather than those they have an individualized suspicion of wrongdoing for. End-to-end encryption is very likely to face extreme pressures. This year it's already begun, which is why I wrote that opinion piece, in the coming years, because if government loses this fight, it is a permanent loss. Once we figure out how to munge that social graph, they will be required to rely on hacking rather than having it as an additional tool on top of mass surveillance or bulk collection, as they call it. I am actually optimistic that we can win this, quite simply because governments can't outlaw end-to-end encryption. They can make sure large companies who operate in their jurisdictions can't do these technologies or have to weaken these technologies. But that doesn't apply to Korea, right? That doesn't apply to any other country, and that doesn't apply to open source software that academics, that researchers, that hobbyists don't sell, but simply give away freely. The question is, how do we make sure that it spreads so quickly that it is a fait accompli and a bell that cannot be unrung?
I think we're going to have to wrap up now, but I was wondering if Dan's mic is working. Martin is our AV guy, to clarify. Martin, do you know if Dan's mic is working?
I saw Dan pop in there for a minute, but Dan, are you still around?
Oh, no.
I'm afraid, because it ran long, maybe he had to step away.
Okay, I don't know. He's here. But I don't think his mic is working, and I don't actually know what we can do to resolve it. The problem with an event being so tech-dependent being that I feel that tech does fail you at the best moments. Okay, in that case, I'm going to have to wrap up. Thank you so much to Ed, to Dan.
Can I just say one thing?
And yeah, your last comments.
It's very quick. Daniel Ellsburg, when he released the Pentagon Papers, was treated as a traitor, and he was perceived as a traitor. It's fairly widespread, and now he's seen as a great American patriot. You'd be hard pushed to find anybody now that thinks the Vietnam War was a good idea. I just hope that Ed I'm not sure what the statistics are in America just now, but the last ones I saw, America was fairly divided, 50-50, on whether Ed is a hero or a traitor. I think it's shifting. Somebody at the NSA just last week was saying that perhaps Ed did the world a service. I just hope that Ed doesn't have to wait 50 years before people decide that he's also an American patriot and he's allowed to go back to America or come to Europe well before then.
Yeah, I think I can speak for everyone in the room when we say that we echo that sentiment, and in terms of the time in Moscow as well, and hoping that you get to return home.
Thank you.
And thank you to you again. So thank you to all of our speakers, to Ewan for coming to Cambridge, and to both of you for Skyping in, or video calling in rather, more accurately. Thank you also to our AV team who have worked hard to make this event possible, and thank you to our stewards for helping out today. We hope that you will enjoy the event, and yeah, thank you very much.